We are officially recording, so we'll go ahead and get into the webinar. So at one of my trainings, I can't remember who gave me this handout of this text and image, so I don't own this. This isn't something I created, but I found it to be really relevant to prevention work, and I thought we could use it to kick us off for today. So Sankofa is a symbolic representation of a unique bird that flies forward. It looks back while protecting the egg between its beaks. It comes from Ghana, a country in West Africa, and is named by the Akan people. It means go back and fetch it. Going back to our roots to move forward is a big part of prevention work. Understanding what we were taught and what was normalized at a young age, fetching that information to better understand the present, and potentially unlearning and relearning certain concepts like love, respect, kindness, healthy relationships, etc. This can help us in the future. So I encourage you all to continue thinking about Sankofa as it relates to your role in violence prevention work. So I will launch the second slide about how do you see the past playing a role in prevention work. So again, you can select as many options as you would like that you feel resonate with. Again, I'll give about 45 more seconds for people to submit what they think of when we think of the past and we think about prevention. One thing that I really like about this text is the part about being able to unlock a future with unlimited possibilities. So that's a big thing, especially when you learn about trauma. The ability to use your imagination and to have hope that things will be different is an essential part of healing and advocacy for sure. All right, so maybe 3 more seconds here. Seems like a lot of people are voting. Okay, I'll end the poll and share the results with you all. So the 2 predominant responses people said with the past playing a role in prevention work is the ability to understand patterns and the ability to understand learned behaviors, as well as the ability to have an understanding of intergenerational trauma. So absolutely, you can continue to look at those poll results as we move on to the next slide. So from the title of this webinar, the central point of our discussion today will be the cyclical nature of domestic violence. And there are a lot of different terms for domestic violence, like family violence, relationship abuse, intimate partner violence. Domestic violence is a broader term that encompasses various forms of abuse and various types of relationships and connections. In a prevention model that we'll discuss later, one of the first steps is defining the issue. So these first few slides will aim to do just that and ensure that we were all on the same page about what we're discussing. Like in AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, they talk about how the first step in fixing or resolving a problem or an addiction is to acknowledge that there is one. So that's why having a main definition and general consensus on what domestic violence is important in being able to educate the community, which is essential to prevention, right? So one more poll, sorry, there won't be back-to-back like this, but just to kick us off, I want to learn a little bit more about your position so we can kind of get a sense of what kind of positions are predominant, so we can kind of tailor the conversation to how you can play a role in your specific profession to promote prevention. We'll give about 30 more seconds. And again, if your position isn't represented on this poll, please send it in the chat if you would like to. Stephanie says that they are a treatment coordinator, also UMICAD certified. I'm not quite sure what that is, but I'd love to learn more about what that is. Smita is faculty of Nalbari Law College from India. Great, thank you. There's a comment about COVID is ensuring our positions carry many new roles. Yeah, there's a lot of different intersections and taking on new responsibilities during these times. Stephanie also talked, drug and alcohol counselor. Okay, great, thank you. All right, well, I'll go ahead and share so other people can see who else is on this call. So it looks like it's predominantly social service providers and domestic violence advocates, with a few other advocates, healthcare, mental health care providers, and a few educators as well. We also have a police officer, so thank you for joining. All right, so similarly, in order to really define the problem, we need to know more about who it impacts. And you can see people with the different social or ethnic identities experience this problem, domestic violence, at disproportionate rates. And knowing these intersecting identities and how they overlap with multiple forms of oppression is important to keep in mind. So no prevention model or effort is one size fits all. That approach has been proven to be unsuccessful, so many efforts need to be culturally specific to be effective. So not only understanding who experiences domestic violence, but also knowing more about the scope of the issue is important to see where there are opportunities for intervention and how impacting one system or public health issue can influence another. So this slide's there's a lot of S's in this, in what I'm trying to say. So this slide serves to share more about areas for improvement and how to address, say, homelessness, and how that can in turn support domestic violence victim survivors because of that overlap and interconnectedness. Lots of stats that are coming up, but I'm mostly just providing it for context. I'm not going to read them all out. I trust that if you'd like to learn more, you can explore the different resources that are attached. So a little more about that. It's difficult to define the issue without contextualizing it with other intersectional experiences like homelessness, firearms, financial instability, human trafficking, traumatic brain injuries, and more. So I just want to include all of this and being able to think about how real people experience domestic violence. They often experience multiple of these issues all at the same time, not in isolation, and so we shouldn't treat it in isolation as well, because that's not how it's experienced, right? I think we have a question. I just saw a little beep. There's a question about why are the numbers for people who are bisexual so high? So you can definitely check out that link that's on that previous slide. It talks a little bit more. It's hard to pinpoint exactly why that is the case. There are some arguments of saying that as far as intimate partner violence, because the genders in which they could develop a relationship with may increase the likelihood of experiencing that violence within the relationship. But I would be hesitant for me to say I'm not an expert on that, but I would encourage you to read more on that the resource, because it has a lot of information on that. So I'm sorry I don't have a direct answer. I don't want to provide the wrong response, but knowing that can be really beneficial. And if anyone else has any insight on that, please feel free. Vianne is saying that psych studies show that people who are bisexual also have the worst mental health as far as sexual orientations go, and after transgender people, right? Thank you for sharing that. Please let me know if there's other questions. Okay, so Amanda says thank you. Great. We will advance. So we're going to take this first step of defining the problem even further. Many of you have probably seen this power and control wheel. It was developed in the 1970s by Dr. Ellen Pence to better understand the common themes and tactics of domestic violence, with power and control being the primary goal. Since then, it has been adapted to take into account other institutions, systems, and cultures that an individual lives within, and that influence how someone experiences domestic violence. So how someone is able to access resources, and even if someone has the systemic and community support to break the cycle of domestic violence. So these different circles also offer and represent opportunities for prevention and intervention. So institutions like courts, police, governments, services, religion, medicine, they all play a role in universal education, mobilizing resources, and responding to domestic violence in an empowering way. And then culture can set the tone for how an individual perceives abuse. So values and norms can influence the decisions that someone makes about a violent relationship. Music, art, language, traditions, all of these can be sources of hope or sources of resignation. So we're going to dive a little deeper into how domestic violence doesn't exist within a vacuum. Poll. Here's another poll about institutions. So what are ways in which you have seen institutions and culture impact victim survivors? So again, you can select multiple, you don't have to just pick one. And again, if there's any that I'm missing from this, please type it in the chat. I'd love to read it. Okay, I'll give about 30 more seconds for people to submit their responses. Okay, it seems like a lot of us have heard of all these different ways. There's some more comments on limited access to genuine resources, normalized rape culture, rigid gender roles and expectations. Absolutely. Okay, thank you for participating in that. HBV. Would you mind, Rebecca, typing out what that acronym is? So it looks like the overwhelming response to the poll is family or culture reinforcing abuse. That's something that's really common in this month. Honor-based violence. Oh, that's a new one for me. I have to make a note of that. I'm gonna make a note. Learn more about that. So thank you for sharing that. If you want to type more, oh, it's a UK term. Okay. Thank you. I'm gonna read more up on that. I encourage you all to do so as well. Some other responses that people have said are negligence of the police and other institutions. We've definitely heard a lot of stories about that as well, of calling for help and either, again, to like being criminalized for that, or the abuser being told, hey, take a walk around the block, calm down, it's a relationship issue, it'll be okay, and not intervening. Or talking to the victim survivor by themselves and asking about safety. There's other responses about lack of culturally specific resources. Absolutely. If their first language or the language they're most comfortable with is not English and the only language that is offered at a shelter or an advocacy program is English, that's a huge barrier. Absolutely. And not understanding the culture that someone, comes with. As well as family-centered values that don't align with leaving an abuser. That's one we hear about very often too, of if they're married, they'd be the first one ever in their family to get a divorce, or just different cultures and practices don't align. And especially if the victim survivor is a woman or a mom saying, it's your responsibility to keep the family together. That's something that can be really difficult and add extra layers of being able to seek safety. Inaccurate portrayals of abuse by media, We also have a comment by Jordan about the fact that many sexual offenders aren't punished, like Brock Turner. So the belief that, you know, within that culture circle, the norm, right? Those gender norms, those expectations, and not holding perpetrators accountable. So them thinking, you know, this is how I want to get what I want, and I won't be held accountable for it. I won't suffer any consequences in a legal sense. So that's absolutely another reason too of how all these things are interconnected and exist within those circles. And also threats to contact ICE are really common too, which can be really, really scary. So I'm going to stop sharing results. Thank you for participating in that. We also have another comment about victim blaming. That's also a part of the culture too, that people exist within. So it's not as easy as just saying, hey, just leave, or hey, get that person to stop harming you. There's a lot of other things to consider, as you all are explaining so well. Myths also, for sure. Thank you. Okay, we'll move on. All right, so earlier with the slides with the different stats, we talked about different identities that people have and how that influences not only the rate at which they experience domestic violence, but even the specific ways that they experience violence, which are oftentimes targeted toward identities that exist within the margins. So identities that others in society could view as vulnerabilities or aren't representative of the majority of the predominant culture. So when you're working in prevention, it's essential to understand how these multiple and often intersecting identities show up in how you advocate, support, and educate someone. So Women's Advocates annual educational panel last year included 8 different community organization representatives who spoke about the various impacts of specific social identities in experiencing domestic violence. So I linked the URL at the top of the screen, so you can watch that video at a later time if you're interested in learning more about that intersectional approach. But just as different identities are connected, different systems of oppression are also connected. So on that note, there's an even broader umbrella term that domestic violence can fall under, and that is gender-based violence. So simply put, gender-based violence is violence directed against a person because of that person's gender, or violence that affects people of a particular gender disproportionately. So there are a lot of other forms of gender-based violence aside from domestic violence, including but not limited to sexual violence, sexual exploitation, and sex trafficking. All right. There are even more forms of violence that are gender-based and stem from the oppressive system of sexism. So this is the sexual violence continuum. This continuum is very much related to the continuum of domestic violence, which we'll discuss a little bit later. Okay. So oftentimes, unfortunately, these issues are siloed. So the efforts can be separate and non-collaborative. Not to say that they all are, but there is a trend of that happening. So these issues intersect quite often, not only in the perpetration of it, but also someone who goes to a domestic violence shelter because they were not safe in their home could also be a victim of sexual assault prior to or as a result of homelessness. These issues are often not experienced in a silo or separately, so it's important for us in the field of gender-based violence to work together. So I also linked another blog we released in April for Sexual Assault Awareness Month, so you can feel free to skim through that as well. But that leads us to the next poll. So this is a simple yes, no, or somewhat. The question is, do you believe victim survivors would benefit from more collaborative and collective approaches to intersecting issues of domestic violence, sexual assault, and sexual exploitation, and other forms of gender-based violence? So it's a handful of a question, but I'm just curious to learn if that's just an observation that I have noticed, or if others feel similarly that people would benefit from more collaboration, which I know there are a lot of barriers to being able to collaborate. But I was just curious what people have to say. So it seems like the majority of us are saying yes, and then a few of us are saying somewhat. I'll give about 15 more seconds to submit your vote. All right, thank you. I'm going to share the results. So the majority said yes, a couple said somewhat. So thank you for engaging in that. We shall progress. So we'll specifically talk about domestic violence for a second here. There are two aspects that this visual is pointing out. So I always say perpetration of intimate partner violence, and so VAC is violence against children, and the normalization of violence. So oftentimes the root of this can be a patriarchal family structure where there's a hierarchy based on sex, particularly being the older man of the home, which is a heteronormative way of understanding family dynamics. I want to acknowledge that. But along with rigid gender and childhood norms and control over subordinate members of the family. So stemming from this structure is also the use of violence for three things. So discipline, expression of masculinity, and to enforce gender norms. So through this process, children often begin to associate violence with something that is normal, something that comes with a part of being in a family, something that is accepted, okay, and even expected. This could cause a victim of abuse to become the perpetrator of abuse later in life. This choice to use violence may be due to bystander trauma. Maybe they were exposed to it as a kid and learned that violence was an effective way to get the things that they want. Which also is related to negative role modeling. So not having an adult who is supportive, loving, and a caring, positive role model, that can make a huge difference in whether or not a victim continues to use violence in relationships. They may also continue to experience violence in adult relationships or use aggression as a response to their own trauma. Insecurities or feelings of fear or when they feel unsafe can also be instances where they would use aggression. So this starts to uncover that pattern that we mentioned earlier in that definition, how this pattern can begin in the family but be reinforced by systems and other forces outside of the family as well. Which leads us into something that someone added earlier about intergenerational trauma. So similarly, we know that when we say break the cycle, it's often referring to the intergenerational cycle of violence. So as I just described in the last slide, what happens in the home at a young age can set the tone and initiate this cycle and pattern that can be difficult to break out of. You'll see that the cycle follows the lifespan from a victim being a child experiencing abuse, to experiencing or perpetrating peer aggression or bullying in elementary and middle school, to experiencing or perpetrating teen dating violence in high school, to then experiencing or perpetrating intimate partner violence and violence against children as an adult. So that is a little bit of insight on what that cycle looks like. I also linked a TED Talk that talks about childhood trauma and how that affects health across the lifespan. So check that out if you're interested. Okay, so moving on to another slide. Additionally, when we talk about the cycle, since this is all about breaking the cycle, what is the cycle? What are we talking about? Yes, we're talking about intergenerational trauma, but also the cycle within an abusive relationship. So many of you have probably seen the cycle of abuse before, and this particular slide has appeared in previous webinars, but I wanted to add a prevention lens to these two cycles. So secondary prevention work, which is a specific level that we'll talk about later, targets these cycles. It aims to break the cycle in this current abusive relationship to empower the victim survivor to escape that relationship and hopefully have access to the education, tools, resources, and support to prevent future victimization in new relationships. So if you're an advocate, which it seems like many of you are, or someone working with a victim survivor who is currently in an abusive relationship, you may observe a pattern or this cycle. Not to say that it's predictable. A significant harmful component of abusive relationships is the unpredictable nature of the violence. But There are notable stages or a sequence that can unfold before or after a specific abusive incident. So as you're working with a victim survivor, oftentimes you may see them immediately after something bad has happened, and you may continue to work with them for a longer period of time, and you'll start to see how this cycle can change the way a victim interacts with you or what their desired course of action is. So like one week, maybe they want a protective order, and another week, they might express that they don't want one, maybe because something happened or they're afraid, or maybe they have hope for change. So identifying the opportunities to help a survivor break out of the cycle can be challenging, especially if it's all that they've ever known. So if you're interested in learning more about the cycle of anxiety and how these two overlap, I recommend you check out our mental health webinar, which is linked on our webinar registration page that you should all have access to and will receive an email about. This is the second to last poll. So this poll is talking about how can knowing these cycles, so the cycle of abuse and cycle of anxiety, better help you support the people that you work with. So again, you can select as many responses as you feel you resonate with. But just to think about, I always try to tie everything I present back to something practical, something applicable of, okay, great, how does this matter? Why does it matter? How can I implement it in my life and in my unique position? Amanda wrote timing for safety planning. Yeah, that's a huge one too, of understanding the ebbs and flows of abuse. And sometimes we see that too of we as advocates view the perfect time to get an OFP, an order for protection, or a DANCO, a domestic abuse no contact order, is when they're here, where they have enclosed walls with security and they're away from the person who's being abusive. But sometimes in the cycle of anxiety and the cycle of abuse, they are still recovering from that trauma, and the first thing that they might do is not, feeling like they need to get that order for protection right away. So knowing that cycle and how that's unique for each person can be really important too. There's a comment about we meet them in the emergency room when they're most receptive to intervention. Yeah, so that period of like right before any kind of honeymoon phase and where all the apologies ensue, right after that abusive incident can be an opportunity to promote them of saying, this is very serious, and they might be more inclined to seeking help. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Most people are saying it helps them better understand the fluctuations of their experiences and emotions and responses. So when you're viewing all of these cycles from the outside, it might be easy to say, like, pick up on that pattern and say, this is bound to happen again, or you might fall into traps of victim blaming, but understanding these cycles can help you be more trauma informed. Other people are saying it can help them identify the pattern of abusive behavior, help them break the cycle, better support mental health, and also generally inform so that you don't judge the unpredictability of it. So most people are talking about the fluctuations. So thank you. I'm going to stop sharing those results. Thank you for participating in that poll. Let me know if you think of anything else. So on that note, studies have also shown that it takes survivors between 7 and even 12 attempts of leaving an abusive relationship before they leave for the last time. So I also mentioned the continuum of sexual violence earlier, so I wanted to be sure to mention the intimate partner violence abuse continuum. So I encourage you all to, again, watch that webinar on mental health. Our licensed mental health therapist, Saran, does an amazing, very thorough job of explaining this continuum. So if you've already seen it, I don't want to kind of be redundant, but all these visuals are tools that you can use when you're helping clients or residents, whoever you're advocating for and supporting. You can use these as ways to understand their experience, because it can be hard to put that into words. So they can look at these models and point and say, yes, this relates to my experience, or this doesn't. And when we talk about prevention, many people look upstream to see what is the root cause. So why is this happening in the first place, and how can we change that? So that's what we're going to get into next. So a decent amount of research has been conducted to kind of answer that exact question. So domestic violence is a choice and it is a learned behavior. So for these reasons, it's difficult to say that domestic violence is caused by any one single factor. There are common beliefs and attitudes that abusers hold that may result in them choosing to use violence. And where they learn to believe these things can be from family growing up, the media, shows, even songs or movies that they watched and listened to. Their peers may condone it. The culture they are surrounded with may promote it or accept it, as we talked about earlier. Over time, these people have learned that maybe this is the way that they get the things that they want. There are a ton of other theories that you can learn more about at the source that I linked at the bottom. But I want to note that no victim survivor causes their own abuse. And while there may be a link between alcohol, drugs, and stress, mental health, none of these things cause someone to be violent, right? So plenty of people drink and do drugs, and they don't all choose to be abusive. So that's one thing that we'll note and continue to talk about. Anthony talked about genderization plays a huge part in behavior of males and females in all societies. Hopefully you will touch on the issue of genderization. Yes, we will talk a little bit more about that, and I also provide more resources and links since we're kind of focused a little more on the prevention models, but that does play a huge role as far as social norms go. So thank you for adding that. Okay, so many programs target the core beliefs that I was talking about earlier. The programs, like prevention programs or intervention programs, they target core beliefs as a way of preventing violence from continuing to occur. So I observed an abuse intervention transformation program in Duluth at the Domestic Abuse Intervention Program. The first question that the facilitators ask of the men in this group, particularly who have been arrested and charged with domestic violence, is what do you do when you don't get your way? And they responded with their different behaviors of different things that they do. They might give the silent treatment. They may use physical abuse. They may block the doorway. They may threaten. They may scream. They may demean and insult that person who is not, quote unquote, obeying what they would like. So then they write down these behaviors on this whiteboard, and then they write another column on the whiteboard and they title it beliefs. And they ask the participants, what beliefs fuel your actions? What are you thinking when you do these things? What makes you think that you can do these things? And many of them answer with, I'm the man of the house. It's my way or the highway. They can't do anything right, referring to the victim. I need to feel in control. The man needs to be the breadwinner. The man needs to be the command of the household. So these beliefs fuel the cycle of abuse, but while that's happening, they may also be instilling harmful negative core beliefs in the victim survivor. So the survivor might start to believe that they're weak, trapped, unlovable, worthless, undeserving of care. Many survivors are directly told things like, no one's ever going to love you the way I do by their abuser, or that no one else is going to want them. So while friends and family or even advocates like us might not think that's the case, these negative core beliefs start to become ingrained in the survivor. They feel real, they feel true. So these core beliefs are embedded within the cycle of anxiety and abuse, and these core beliefs can continue to contribute to the cycle of violence. So the core beliefs that the abuser holds, they can carry those core beliefs with them, and that could fuel more abusive actions and behaviors when they're with someone new. It's common for an abuser to have a history of assault charges with a former partner, and these beliefs cause the abuser to continue to use violence in other relationships, even when others try to intervene. So abuse is often how perpetrators know and learn how to handle conflict. Similarly, for the survivor, they may still believe all of these things even when they're in a new relationship that might be healthier. So many different therapeutic or intervention efforts target these core beliefs of both the survivor and the abuser to start to change them, even if it's all that they've ever known. So that's an essential step in breaking the cycle. So the very last poll, and the rest will be more kind of information providing, is about beliefs. But you can always engage in the chat, please send your questions, your comments, your contributions, your suggestions. I don't have all the answers, all the information, so we're all learning together. So the question is, do the prevention efforts that you know of or are a part of, do they address core beliefs? Did I mistype? Help by, oops. It's supposed to say, do the prevention efforts that you know of or are a part of address core beliefs held, not help, held by victims and abusers? So some of the theory and idea behind this is if we can address what is fueling the abusive behavior and start to change that, you'll in turn change the behavior and hopefully replace it with something that is more healthy. Okay, so 60% of us are saying somewhat, some of them kind of do, 30% are saying yes, and then 10% are saying no, the prevention efforts don't kind of target those core beliefs. Amanda wrote about early intervention. I'm wondering if you're saying early intervention is typically where they address core beliefs, but I don't want to make that assumption, but feel free to expand. Thank you for adding that. So I'll share the results and then we'll keep chugging along here. Okay. So next up, due to many of these core beliefs being rooted in male supremacy, it's important to also talk about how various other social justice movements are connected to gender justice. So one of these is particularly related to the Black Lives Matter movement, so racial justice, right? Also related to June as Pride Month is trans and queer liberation. So I won't read these all out to you, but I think that these components are an important part of the discussion. So I highly, highly recommend that you check out the resource that is linked. I think it's really important and relevant, but in the interest of time, I'll just leave it there. But if there's any other information that people want to talk about regarding this, I wholeheartedly invite that. So feel free to let me know. And again, here, maybe I'll send the link in the chat right now. So if you want to continue to read this as I go on, you can do that. So I'll try to find that in a second, but we'll continue in the meantime to more about oppressive systems. So again, this slide is super busy. It's mostly just for you to refer to and learn more about it because I think it's important to talk about. So in addition to male supremacy, there are other oppressive forms that we briefly mentioned before. So I hope to have a specific webinar next month that are dedicated to this interconnected systems of oppression. But for now, I'll leave you with this slide with the overarching note of what's in the gray box there. So all oppression, systems of oppression particularly, are perpetrated by the belief that power must be power over rather than shared power. So layers of oppression make some people more vulnerable to sexual and intimate partner violence. So that's something of like kind of tying it back to the main central theme of what we're talking about today, but also keeping all of these other forms in mind because they're all influencing the people that we're serving on a daily basis. So there's two resources linked on this slide. The one at the top really talks about social norms. So I'm going to include that because I think that might be what, let's see if it'll let me, Anthony is talking about with genderization. So feel free to check that resource out. Okay, now more on to specific models of prevention. So I've been alluding to various models of prevention thus far, so I think it makes sense to really dive into what those are. So generally, prevention means taking action to stop a problem before it can begin. So I grabbed this following information that I'm going to talk about from the Minnesota statewide coalition Violence Free Minnesota, because I wholeheartedly agree that violence prevention means stopping violence before it occurs and addressing the short-term and long-term consequences of violence that has already happened. To prevent violence before it begins and address harm that has already occurred, we need the efforts of individuals, families, communities, and societies across the age spectrum to encourage relationships of empowerment and confidence. So prevention is a collaborative process that looks different for every community. And so Violence Free Minnesota talks about promoting prevention by training health providers to recognize signs of abuse, that they address systems of oppression like racism, classism, and sexism, along with issues like pay equity that prevent victims from accessing safety. So on the right, the visual is from the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. It talks about violence prevention using the public health model. So we already discussed defining the problems and many programs that identify risk and protective factors, which I added a link at the top there for everyone to learn more about that. And then developing and testing prevention strategies and implementing those on a large scale. So Veto Violence also offers a model for how prevention requires change at all levels. So the individual through maybe things like healthy relationship education, the relationship level, so things like other family and friends, promoting healthy relationship skills, community level, so things like bystander intervention strategies, and even societal, so things like policy and lawmaking. I do see a comment, Anthony expanded more, so I'll read that out loud to everyone. So as a male and as a police officer growing up, learning how to interact with males and being aggressive as part of normal socialization process. I and most males were never taught how to be gentle and non-patriarchal. So I think as a society, we need to start teaching boys how to be compassionate and less competitive, etc., with girls and females. Absolutely. I'm going to include a link to Men as Peacemakers, because they are huge leaders in that effort of engaging boys and men and masculine folks in, peacemaking, as it's saying. But I think that's absolutely true. So please check out that link if you're interested in learning more about how to specifically engage men, as we know that they constitute the majority of people who are perpetrating violence against women. So thank you for adding that, Anthony. And let me know if you had a question, but I wanted to make sure that comment was shared. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about strategies. So the image on the left talks about things we also just mentioned, but a little deeper. So things like linking the community, mobilization, opportunities provision, so trainings like these could even fall under that category. Social intervention, so maybe more youth-led efforts. Suppression like community policing and organizational change and development. So again, implementing those policies. And so now finally getting to more about the levels of prevention. So you can see the image on the right with the waterfall. There's different levels of the waterfall. At the very top where it starts, where the water starts and the root of it is primary prevention. So stopping violence before it occurs. Our work in middle schools, high schools, and colleges focus on this level. So you can learn more about that specifically during our Engaging Youth webinar on Monday. So tune into that if you're interested. Then the secondary level of prevention is immediate responses to violence, which is where the shelter aspect of women's advocates comes into play. So giving victim survivors a safe space to reside in. And then tertiary, so long-term responses to violence can include things like Women's Advocates Aftercare Program, where we help survivors find and maintain safe, sustainable housing for them and their children, and things like the DAP Abuse Transformation Program. So if you want to learn more about how Women's Advocates approaches prevention, you can watch our Women's Advocates 101 webinar. It's linked on the screen. It talks a lot about that, or tune in on Monday. Okay, I'll take a quick breather. If there's any questions, feel free to add it in the chat. I know I've been talking for a while here. And then at the end too, I will try to unmute people if they want to speak any question or add anything. Okay. So there's a comment from Amanda about having our justice systems demonstrate that assault within the home will not be tolerated. Having more rigid consequences, slaps on the wrists are common. Yeah, absolutely. So having more systems in place to hold abusers accountable and being able to intervene. Absolutely. Thank you for adding that. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about common prevention efforts. So a lot is missing from this, but I just wanted to have a succinct visual for what this looks like in practice. So in practice, there's a lot of different efforts, and I linked some of the organizations that are doing an amazing job in each of these realms. So I talked a little bit about our in-school prevention, which we're going to really dive into on Monday, so I'm not going to speak on it too much. But there's a lot of other organizations that are doing this work, like Alexandria House and Tubman and Cornerstone. I know in a prevention meeting, they also have talked about how they're continuing to provide school-based support for students when it comes to family violence, dating violence, sexual violence, through online platforms and advocacy in that way. So I know particularly Cornerstone has been doing a lot of work on that. So I would recommend that you check out their websites. And then youth-led efforts as well. So I talked about our state coalition, Violence Free Minnesota. They have a youth advisory board. I don't know if Maggie, she's their prevention person. I don't know if she's on this call. If not, she can feel free to add some more comments in the chat about that initiative. And they also created a Real Love Is campaign. It's an account on Instagram. It's led by youth. It's for youth. It's a really great example of how to do that. Also, support groups are very common of being able to promote prevention, as well as, again, those abuse transformation programs, domestic violence advocacy, and also community education and consciousness raising, which happens a lot during specific months. So you'll see an increase in consciousness raising during months like February for Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month, or October for Domestic Violence Awareness Month. There's another addition in the chat of making changes in family cohort so abuse cannot be continued through that process as well. Absolutely. It requires the engagement of a lot of different people in a lot of different spaces. So thank you for adding that. Kind of on a related note, there are a lot of different challenges when it comes to prevention work. And I know from talking to our development person here at Women's Advocates, there is a lack of funding and resources that go to prevention. So there's a lot of other money that's being funneled into emergency shelter and things of that nature, and kind of addressing homelessness, but there's a lot of there's not a lot, I guess I should say, of resources for prevention work. So that's one barrier, absolutely. Also, issues with consistency and standardization. So it's difficult to be able to access all of the different schools in a given state and in a given country even, and across the world. So being able to continue to give those resources can be difficult. Lack of cultural competency can be difficult too, not having enough community-centered and community-led initiatives, not because they're not interested and they don't feel that it's important, but more so because, again, lack of resources and lack of support. And difficulty with promotion and awareness. That can be hard. I know I've done a couple of pop-up events at different organizations, different stores, different businesses, and sometimes people aren't really interested in it unless they have been directly impacted. So that little acronym at the end stands for what's in it for me. And some people really need to be persuaded that A, domestic violence is an issue, and B, that they can make a difference, and C, that the difference that they make is worthwhile, is worth investing in. So there's probably a lot of other challenges that aren't mentioned on here, so feel free to add those in to be a part of that conversation. But I just want to acknowledge that this work is extremely important, but there are barriers to being able to do it in a widespread way. There's another comment from Amanda about it's so difficult to deliver the prevention message behind closed doors. So if you could expand on that, that'd be great, because I don't want to make assumptions about what you have to say. But when I was reading that, it made me think about how a lot of this education happens within families and within friends. So if you do have something going on in your relationship and you want advice, typically people are going to go to their friends and say, is this normal? Is this okay that this happened? Or maybe they're embarrassed to do so. So making sure that those people that they would go to are educated as well. Amanda talks about we're educating victims on prevention again, and initial act of violence has already occurred. Yeah, thank you for adding that. Continue to add in your chat as we move forward. It is almost 2, so I'm going to focus the remainder of the webinar on different resources and different efforts, both worldwide, nationally, and even locally as well. So we'll focus the remainder time of that, and then we'll have a designated time for extra questions or discussion that people are doing prevention work and they want to talk more about what they're doing, and I 100% welcome that. So we're going to get to that right now. But that was the bulk of the information I have to provide about prevention. So these are some links about worldwide efforts that are going on. So I encourage you all to check them out. I'm going to send the link to the PDF right now so you can start to click through those and learn more. Let me grab this. Okay. PDF of PowerPoint slides. And you'll also get this in an email, so no worries. If you don't click on it right away, you'll get this in an email, but you can scroll through to this slide or any of the previous slides to learn more. But these are some, I can't speak specifically to many of them because I haven't interacted with them as much, but I did find the global DV and COVID-19 efforts to be really interesting to learn about. So I 100% recommend that you check that out. And I know we do have people outside of the US that are on the webinar right now. So if you want to send links in the chat to prevention efforts in your country that you would like to share, I would be more than happy to send that out in the email as well. And then for national efforts, there's a ton. Again, it's not comprehensive or an exhaustive list. This is just a lot that I'm a little more familiar with. So I did link at the very top the CDC technical package for violence prevention. That has a lot of great information. But Casa de Esperanza does great work. I know I didn't link them in the youth, but they do great community-based, community-led efforts in the Latinx community with engaging men and boys in violence prevention. And doing so in a way that is culturally informed and relevant and specific. So that is a national effort, but they also have local initiatives, of course, in different states, including Minnesota. Break the Cycles, another really common one. Prevent IPV, Futures Without Violence, KnowMore.org, Prevent Connect. There's so many different resources that are national, but of course accessible to anyone who wants to learn more. So I would encourage you all to check these out. Let me know if there's anything missing from this list. But again, I won't spend too much time reading those out to you. Then local. So again, not everything is represented here, but there is a prevention network in Minnesota if you're interested in attending those meetings. Maggie Royer at Violence Free Minnesota is kind of in charge of facilitating that. So if you're interested in attending the next Prevention Network meeting, you can reach out to her or reach out to me if you need her email. And I'm pretty sure you can, it's also like linked on the slide, so you can go there and check it out. There's a lot of other resources, specifically in Minnesota. Later, I have a guide for a bunch of different programs in Minnesota, so this doesn't necessarily include that. But yeah, I guess I'll just leave it at that. Again, not comprehensive. I have a whole nother document for that. So this is a final note about how to get involved with prevention work. So it seems like you all have ideas or are already involved, but these are just general ideas that I normally share with someone who would attend like a DV 101, domestic violence 101, just to learn more about it. The number one thing that I always talk about it, and I know that you all, if you're domestic violence advocates, you probably talk about it a lot, but even when I started this work, I found that because people knew where I worked, other people in different sectors of my life reached out to me. I don't know if that's been the case for you all, but that has given me the opportunity to talk about it with others, with my family members, with my friends, with other people, colleagues. So that's one of the biggest ways of increasing that awareness about domestic violence, how it's experienced, how to help someone, how to, again, we talked about myths earlier, so like dismantling those myths. And yeah, so I won't again read these out, but these are some ideas if you're curious and learning more about how to get involved with that, especially for people who have worked in this field for a very long time. They might be wanting to learn more about upstream approaches of why the heck does this keep happening? Why are these services needed, you know, decades and decades later after being formed? So these are some ideas. If anyone has any other specific opportunities for people to get involved in prevention, please feel free to share them in the chat. Next, we have bystander intervention resources. So I just included a bunch of links because I figured we wouldn't have too much time to talk about this, but I know people are really interested in how to do a de-escalation or how to intervene. It's not that people don't care or don't have empathy for victim survivors, but maybe they're not informed or educated. So these resources can start to provide more support and information on how to do that. And then this next slide, if I can get over to it, is on wellness promotion for providers. So I absolutely think it's important to bring attention to your wellness. So as providers, caregivers, advocates, it's essential that your wellness is a priority. Common phrase nowadays is you can't pour from an empty cup. So here I gathered some helpful resources to help bring some practical self-care into your lives and mitigate burnout so you can continue to do what it is that you feel called to do, which for many of you is make a difference in other people's lives. So I understand that during times like these especially, our needs and desires have a way of being put on the back burner. But we're truly helping other people when we decide to help ourselves too. So if you find this relevant or send it to someone that you know, a coworker that might need it, that's why the slide is included. Earlier, I referenced a very comprehensive resource guide, so that can be found here on our resource hub. So we have a lot of different trifolds that you can download, print, email, that are more condensed. But if you want a more comprehensive list, we also have a Google Doc that we continually update. So if you have any suggestions for something to add to that, send an email to me and I'll add it to the list. I'll show you very quickly what this hub looks like. So if you click on that link, there's COVID-19 specific resources on trauma and racism and domestic violence in that intersection. So we have a trifold. So you can click on those. This is a specific local resource for Minnesota, particularly the Twin Cities. So it has different categories for that as well, because we know those intersections and survivors need support in other areas. And then we also have a trifold that's specific to youth. So if you are doing prevention efforts and you want a pamphlet or something to send to, this is youth specific. So we have safety tips, cell phone, everyday safety tips. These are youth specific resources, some more language, and some warning signs and safety planning information as well. So again, that's on our website here. And then this is what I was talking about earlier for the Google Doc that is searchable. So you can search, you can click on the table of contents to navigate to a specific type of resource. Earlier I mentioned things like support groups, so you can find a specific resource for support groups. So this is the table of contents. And if you're looking for, what did I just say, support groups? If you go to maybe say mental health services, you can click on that and it'll navigate straight here, and it has contact information, and each of the titles are linked to their website too. So utilize our resource hub as much as you would like. And then next is more information about safety planning. So I put a ton of links about safety planning because that's always a question in any webinar that I do. So if you want more specific resources and links for that, this slide has all information that you might need. Similarly, if you want to continue learning about prevention, I 100% encourage it. And these are all the links. So a lot of these links are things that I couldn't fit into a 90-minute presentation. It's meant to be an ongoing conversation. So hopefully this sparked some interest. You've learned about something a little new, or it was a nice refresher of what you already knew. But this has a bunch of information. Like this recipe card is really cool. I thought it was an interesting way of talking about, oh, we have to download it, but talking about prevention. So there's a lot of different tools in talking about those efforts. So feel free to check those out. Lastly, we have a live chat feature. So if you have any questions and you want to chat with something right away, or if someone that you're working with needs support and you can't provide it at that time, you can always refer them to our website. We have a live chat, and a trained advocate will chat with them online in real time. Especially during COVID, we're noticing that a lot of survivors are in the same space, kind of trapped in where their abuser is, so that it might not be safe for them to call a hotline. So if it's more safe for them to maybe text in the bathroom or like chat on our website, this is an option for you all to be aware of. That's all that I have. So I did include some more slides that I'm not going to talk about, but they all have the resource links on them so you can learn more, but this is just the visual representation. So these are things that even Anthony was talking about earlier about genderization. So these really get into the nitty-gritty of that. Again, I hope to have a webinar where we can really break all of that down, but I wanted to focus more on prevention. But yes, these are all really great resources. I highly recommend that you check them out. But that's it. That's all I have. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. But if you have any questions, please send them in the chat. If you want to be unmuted, you can go ahead and raise your hand and I will unmute you. But again, when you exit out of the webinar, you'll be directed to a post-webinar survey where you can give feedback about this webinar, anything that was missing, anything that you particularly liked. And then you'll also receive, or I'll send it right now actually. If you want a certificate of attendance for coming to this webinar, you can click on this link. So I'll add it here. You can request one there and we'll email you a certificate in the next few days. But other than that, please let me know if you have any additional questions or any comments that you would like to share. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.